The night sky over the Crownlands was thick with clouds that pressed low and heavy, swallowing the moon and stars in a shroud of foreboding dark. On the battlements of the Red Keep, a lone watchman felt the wind slice across his cheeks, far colder than a summer eve had any right to be. He wrapped his cloak tight around his shoulders, drawing comfort from the warmth of the torches flickering in sconces along the walls. In the courtyard below, soldiers of the crown bustled about, some preparing to march, others returning from clandestine errands. They were living in strange times, months into a war meant to decide the fate of kings, heirs, and royal lines. Little did they know a force altogether more ancient and more horrifying was stirring in the far north, moving inexorably toward a realm unprepared to face it. Across the sea of tents outside King's Landing, an army of Baratheon and Stark men lay encamped. The rebellion against the Mad King had gained momentum, capturing hearts and minds who believed in the cause of Robert Baratheon, who claimed the Iron Throne in the name of justice for the atrocities committed by House Targaryen's deranged sovereign. Nightly, the campfires flickered across the horizon. It was in that camp, in a hastily erected pavilion, that Eddard Stark stood before a rough-hewn wooden table cluttered with maps and marked with wax seals bearing the sigils of wolves, stags, and falcons. At his side stood Jon Arryn and Hoster Tully, older men, wise in the ways of the realm. Robert was off drinking and boasting at some corner of the camp, as he was often wont to do after a day's worth of planning or battle. Yet Ned, with the meticulousness that was his hallmark, continued to pore over the parchment lines that showed the roads, hills, and rivers of Westeros. Their shared cause was simple: unseat the tyrant Aerys II Targaryen, crown Robert Baratheon as king, and usher in what they hoped would be a more just era. There were arguments in that tent about how to storm the city, about negotiating with Tywin Lannister or forging alliances with uncertain lords. But none of them had any inkling of the chilling news about to arrive from the north. None of them could guess that the wheels of fate were turning in ways that would cast aside all such ordinary concerns. Not yet. Miles away to the north, beyond the Neck, beyond the old fortress of Moat Cailin, something far more sinister was happening than lords and knights scheming for thrones. At Winterfell, the vast courtyards lay silent under a sky filled with the northern lights, an omen seldom seen this far south. The swirling colors of green and pale purple writhed across the heavens like a cosmic dance of ghosts. Brandon Stark, the new lord of the castle since his father's untimely death, saw those lights and felt a prickling at the back of his neck. He had lived through a year of heartbreak and fury: the murder of his father and brother at the hands of Aerys, the betrothal of his sister Lyanna to Robert Baratheon, and now the war that raged throughout the realm. As he stood upon the ramparts of his ancestral home, peering into the darkness, he felt an unshakable sense of dread. The gates of Winterfell were closed for the night. Guards patrolled with torches guttering in the stiff wind. Inside the great hall, a few servants and lesser lords tried to keep the atmosphere warm, if only with their chatter and the glow of a roaring hearth. Food had grown scarcer, especially for common folk. War drained every resource. Yet Brandon could not sleep. Rumors had reached him of phantom shapes sighted north of the wall, of chilling winds even in the midst of summer. He told himself it was naught but the panic of frightened men who had never known true cold. But he could not fully convince himself. The dream he'd had 3 nights in a row refused to leave him. A dream of shadows moving in the heart of the Weirwood forest, of eyes like icy stars, of swords that gleamed with frost. In his dream, a strange chorus of whispers told him all men's battles for crowns and titles would soon be as dust upon an avalanche. Far beyond Winterfell, at Castle Black, the ancient stronghold of the Night's Watch, Ser Alliser Thorne stood at the top of the wall and breathed in the cold. This far up, the night air was like shards of glass cutting into the lungs, and the wind roared with a relentless fury. The old ice stretched in both directions, immense and unyielding, an 800-foot barrier meant to protect the realm. The men in black cloaks kept watch through the long night, their breaths misting before their faces. No one had ever suspected that their oath, to guard the realms of men, would soon be tested as it had not been in thousands of years. After all, the stories of the Long Night and the White Walkers were told at mothers' knees to frighten unruly children. The others were said to be a myth, an old wives' tale, or the invention of maesters to explain ancient cataclysms. But as always, truth lingered behind the myths, waiting for an age of disbelief to return and strike when men's eyes were turned away. That same night, a young ranger named Taran returned to Castle Black, half-frozen, staggering and wild-eyed. His cloak was in tatters, his hair matted with frost, and his lips were cracked open. The watchman had raced down the wooden stairs to help him. He was delirious. "They're coming," he whispered, voice trembling. "Gods preserve us, they're coming." He collapsed before he could say more. The maesters tried to coax him back from whatever horrors had stolen his mind, but he could do no more than mutter about things moving under the snow, blue eyes glowing in the dark, and a cold that seemed alive. Within a day, Taran was dead, succumbing to wounds they could not even detect with normal medicine. That was the night the Raven flew south with a black-edged letter. East in the city of Bravos, red priests and sea captains might have felt a distant tremor in the tapestry of the world. But the events that now unfolded in Westeros would soon overshadow mercantile concerns and religious rifts. As Robert's rebellion continued, the realm's gaze remained firmly fixed on the drama of swords and war cries, of battered shields and rightful heirs. No one noticed that the far north was about to disgorge a nightmare into the land. Yet in King's Landing, in the heart of the Red Keep, a single raven arrived bearing a message from Castle Black, urgent and strange. Maester Pycelle, roused from his bed in the dark hours, broke the seal with trembling hands. He expected some talk of wildlings, or a new warden of the north switching allegiances. Such tidings were not uncommon in these turbulent times. Instead, he found a single line scrawled with shaky handwriting. "In the name of all that lives, send help. The dead walk." Shock took him as he stared at those words, and sweat beaded on his brow. Could this be an elaborate joke, or the ravings of a madman? He paced in his chambers for a long time, uncertain of whether he should even bring such a letter to King Aerys. The Mad King had been growing worse by the day, prone to paranoia and unpredictable rages. But the words, "the dead walk," hounded the old maester, tugging at half-forgotten lore from the darkest corners of his mind. In a moment of uncharacteristic resolve, Pycelle took the message to Queen Riella. She was the one person in the Red Keep who might listen without flying into a rage. The queen, her eyes hollow with sadness, read the message by candlelight, her lips parted as if to utter a prayer. Her cheeks were pale, and she clutched the letter with tense fingers. She had no illusions about her husband's state of mind, nor about how dire the war was becoming. In her heart, she felt that something terrible had begun. With no one else she trusted, she summoned Ser Barristan Selmy in the utmost secrecy and whispered the contents of the Raven's tidings. Ser Barristan was known for his chivalry, his unwavering loyalty, but even he could not mask the flicker of alarm in his usually calm face. "I fear telling his grace might only worsen his fits," the knight said gravely. "Yet if Castle Black truly calls for aid, it cannot be ignored. Perhaps Prince Rhaegar should be told." The queen agreed, suspecting that her husband would do nothing but burn the letter or the messenger if he learned of this. Rhaegar Targaryen, the heir apparent, might be more open-minded about what a desperate plea from the Night's Watch could mean. At the time, Rhaegar was miles away, leading the royal host against the rebels. The prince still clung to hope that a negotiated settlement might be possible, though the atrocities committed by his father, especially the death of Rickard Stark and his son Brandon, had ignited a hatred that was difficult to soothe. Yet Rhaegar was, by nature, more thoughtful than his father, and there were whispers that if he ascended to the throne, the Seven Kingdoms might have a renaissance under his gentle rule. Some might call him dreamy or even unfit for the brutal realities of war, but he was not a man to dismiss fables. Often he was found in the old library, reading cryptic prophecies and ancient texts. He believed in the power of omens. Meanwhile, along the burnished coasts of the Stormlands, Robert Baratheon's war host had entrenched themselves. Their confidence had soared after key victories, even though Tywin Lannister's forces now loomed ominously on the edges of the conflict, still deciding which side to join. Over roasted boar and flagons of ale, Robert would grin and slam a gauntlet fist against the table, boasting how he would split open the Targaryen line. At times, he'd speak with sorrow of Lyanna, whose disappearance still weighed heavily on his heart, fueling his anger toward the Dragonspawn, who he blamed for her fate. Most men in his army believed that once King's Landing fell, the war would be over. No one predicted a foe from beyond the wall that might render their quarrel meaningless. But the ravens did not stop. Missives from Castle Black, from Eastwatch by the Sea, from the Shadow Tower, each more urgent and half-crazed than the last, began to scatter across the Seven Kingdoms. Where once lords might have dismissed talk of walking corpses and cold-born terrors, the unrelenting nature of the pleas began to sow alarm. At first, rumors spread in taverns and inns, passed by travelers whispering that something monstrous was stirring in the far north. Few believed them. But then came actual sightings, a handful of rangers stumbling back from beyond the wall with haunted faces, or an entire northern village found empty, houses torn open as if from the inside, everything coated in a rime of frost. The hush that fell over Winterfell when these stories arrived was like a pall of dread. No one spoke openly of it, but the old men and grandmothers recalled half-remembered tales of the others. And with each passing day, the cold deepened, unnatural and biting. Word even reached the rebels' camp outside of King's Landing that the Starks and their bannermen in the north were preparing for an onslaught of a different kind. At first, Robert's men scoffed. Some new trick of the Targaryens, they said. Or perhaps the Starks have lost their stomach for war and conjured a ghost story to withdraw. But Eddard Stark, stoic and solemn, knew better. All his life, his father had taught him that winter was inevitable, that the long night was not merely a fable. He made a choice that would alter the course of the rebellion he left to see for himself. By that time, the war was at a critical juncture. Walking away could be seen as betrayal. But Ned Stark had never been one to be held back by politics when he believed his home and his people were in danger. He entrusted command of his men to Robert and to Jon Arryn, explaining that he must confirm what was happening in the north. Despite Robert's furious objections, he wanted Ned at his side for the final push. There was no stopping the Lord of Winterfell. So Ned rode north with a small escort, hearts in their throats at the stories that awaited them. In King's Landing, the tension was suffocating. Aerys's paranoia had reached a fever pitch. The Mad King had begun ordering nightly burnings of any he suspected of treason, including some who had merely whispered that the realm faced a greater threat. Blood and smoke hung in the corridors like a foul tapestry. The dragon skulls that lined the throne room seemed to glower with disapproval at their blood-soaked air. While the king ranted about traitors within every shadow, a letter finally reached Rhaegar, penned by his mother in desperate secrecy, telling him of the pleas from the Night's Watch. Rhaegar read the letter by lamplight at his war camp near the Trident. He was wearing his armor, the rubies on his breastplate catching the flicker of the lamp's flame. As his violet eyes scanned each word, his face grew pallid. He recalled the ancient legends contained in dusty tomes about the prince that was promised, the champion who would stand against the darkness. Much of it was cryptic, but one refrain stood out: if the dead walked, then the realm itself was in mortal peril. Even the crown and the throne would be trifling concerns compared to this threat. That realization weighed on him like a cold chain around his neck. He called for a trusted retainer and asked to see if any from the Night's Watch had arrived at the war camp, but none had. Most men in the camp were uninterested in the ravings of a distant border force. However, Rhaegar could not shake the sense that his destiny, whatever it might be, lay in confronting this new threat. Meanwhile, the north faced the first real signs that the others had awakened. All along the vast tundra between the wall and the haunted forest, entire swaths of land fell, eerily silent. At the small hill fort of Last Hearth, the Umbers mustered their men after shepherds found frozen bodies lying in fields, their flesh white as milk, their eyes burned blue in the gloom. Off to the east, near the Bay of Seals, fishing villages were discovered empty, with footprints in the snow leading away into the darkness. The living who tried to follow those prints never returned. Every so often, someone spotted a figure on the horizon, a tall shape draped in something like armor of ice, moving with an inhuman grace. Then, with a shift of wind or swirl of snow, it vanished. The old goose-flesh terror of ghost stories became a living horror. When Eddard Stark finally reached Winterfell, he found the castle abuzz with activity. Brandon Stark, grim-faced and wearing a fur-lined cloak, welcomed his brother with a bone-crushing hug. They had lost so much already. Losing each other now was unthinkable. In the Great Hall, they spoke in hushed tones. Brandon laid out what he knew, telling of sightings in the woods, the whites that roamed under the command of the White Walkers, and the desperate messages from the Night's Watch. If these monsters truly exist, Brandon said, we have precious little time. The watchmen at Castle Black have lost dozens to them already, and from all accounts, steel barely slows them. Fire is more effective, but how does one set an entire army of the dead aflame? Ned listened, swallowing the rising panic in his chest. He had come north to be certain, but the look in his brother's eyes told him everything. It was real. The others, or White Walkers, or whatever name one gave them, were no longer a children's story. I fear we can't face them alone, Ned said quietly. All the might of the North might not be enough. We'll need to unite with the South. Even with the rebellion raging, we may have no choice. He paused, his thoughts turning to Robert, a man who hated Targaryens with every fiber of his being, and Aerys, a king who would burn the entire world if it displeased him. How could they possibly unite with that madness on the throne? Yet the threat demanded it. The White Walkers were no enemy of flesh and blood, they were death incarnate, indifferent to the ambitions of men. Word was that even Valyrian steel, a rarity in the realm, was one of the few metals that could truly harm them. But there were not enough Valyrian blades in the entire land to arm a single battalion. And if the legends were true, Dragonsteel or Dragonglass might be the key. Dragonglass, the obsidian from the volcanic lands of Dragonstone, could kill these creatures, so the tales said. That rumor might be their only hope, but forging obsidian into effective weaponry was no simple feat. It would take time, and time was in short supply. To the surprise of many, Ned sent a raven to Robert Baratheon and to Tywin Lannister, to Mace Tyrell, to every major house in the realm, urging a cessation of hostilities until the threat from the north was repelled. He begged them to heed the words of the Night's Watch, that the dead had risen and marched south. Robert's reaction was predictable fury at first, thinking it a Targaryen trick or, at best, a dire misjudgment. But Ned was no liar, and eventually Robert could not ignore the sincerity in his friend's words. Loras Tyrell, and indeed much of the South, dismissed it outright as well. Tywin Lannister, more cunning, suspected a ploy but decided to wait and see which way the winds blew. Only Jon Arryn, ever the voice of reason, openly supported Ned's plea. Yet that was not enough to shift the tide of the war by itself. Unbeknownst to Ned, Rhaegar Targaryen had received similar tidings. He too was urged by the Night's Watch to unite the realm. Caught between his father's madness and the horrifying possibility that the others had returned, Rhaegar made a fateful decision. He would seek parley with Robert Baratheon himself. If the realm was in mortal danger, they would need every knight and every peasant armed to face it. It felt almost impossible, bridging the chasm of blood and hatred between them, but Rhaegar felt a strange compulsion, perhaps it was destiny. Gathering his most trusted knights, including Ser Arthur Dayne and Ser Barristan Selmy, he rode forth under a white banner of truce to meet Robert. The location chosen was a small fishing village near the Blackwater Rush, a place of no strategic importance, neutral ground for both sides. In the early dawn light, Robert and a retinue of his own loyal men arrived. The air was still, heavy with tension. They stood across from the Targaryen prince and his Kingsguard, uncertain of what to say, uncertain if this was some elaborate snare. Robert's fists were clenched, shoulders bunched with suppressed rage. For a moment, they stared at each other, Robert the rebel, barrel-chested, warhammer slung across his back, dark hair falling over ferocious eyes, Rhaegar the prince, slender yet poised, silver hair glinting in the morning sun. Eyes that carried sorrow and determination. Robert was the first to break the silence. Why call for truce now, Targaryen? His voice was a growl. Is it because your father is losing his grip? Or are you finally ready to pay for what was done to Lyanna and my friends? He spat on the ground, fury trembling in his throat. Rhaegar held his gaze. This has nothing to do with my father, he said quietly. It is about the kingdom, about every living soul in Westeros. If the tales from the Night's Watch are true, we are all in peril. He gestured to the north. If the others are truly marching, do you believe they will care who sits the Iron Throne? Robert snorted, yet he hesitated. He was impulsive but not a fool. He had read Ned's letter, seen the frantic lines describing the unholy threat. I know Ned Stark. He's not one to invent fantasies. Still, he leveled a hard stare at the prince. Your father burned his kin. He murdered children in their cradles. Should I simply forgive all? That? Rhaegar's voice was weary. I cannot undo what my father has done. I can only act now to save us from a threat greater than any king's injustice. He dropped his gaze for a moment as if remembering the countless lives ruined by Aerys. Allow me to march north, side by side with any man of the realm who will join me. Let us confirm the truth, and if it is so, then I ask that we unite under a common banner to defeat the others. Afterward, if you still wish for my head, I will meet you in single combat. A hush followed that challenge. Ser Barristan and Ser Arthur both tensed, but Rhaegar did not flinch, holding Robert's gaze. Robert's knuckles turned white around the hilt of his warhammer. He could almost taste the vengeance on his tongue. But a part of him, perhaps the part that had grown to trust Ned Stark's judgment, saw that Rhaegar was sincere. Finally, Robert spat again and nodded just once. Fine. I'll not strike down a man who rides to defend the realm from walking corpses if that's indeed what we face. We'll have our war on hold, Targaryen, but this isn't peace. It's a ceasefire. When it's done, I'll see you in the field or in the yard for that single combat, you have my word. Rhaegar inclined his head in acceptance, relief flickering in his eyes. The men on both sides loosened their grips on their weapons. This had been a gamble, but for now it had paid off. Arrangements were made for a precarious alliance, the forces loyal to Robert, the Riverlands under Hoster Tully, the Vale under Jon Arryn, and the Crown's loyalists under Rhaegar would each send detachments north to investigate the threat. They would treat each other as uneasy allies. Fights might break out among the rank and file, but the command was clear: do not engage each other unless provoked. The war was paused, though Aerys had not agreed to it. Rhaegar intended to speak to his father soon, hoping against hope that the Mad King would see reason when confronted with the possibility of an existential threat. Many doubted that was possible, but for now the immediate concern was to muster an army that could face the rumored nightmares of the North. As riders galloped across the realm bearing messages of this pact, the small folk stood stunned. The rebels and Targaryens allied? Some believed it was a sign the world was ending, others whispered that the gods themselves had intervened. The tension lingered in every corner of the land. Yet something else began to grip their minds, the creeping cold that seeped farther south each day. Even in the Reach, nights turned brisk. In the Riverlands, a late summer snow fell for the first time in living memory. Crops withered under frost that should never have formed at that time of year. Livestock died by the dozens, found stiff and frozen at dawn. Maesters scratched their heads, trying to understand a phenomenon that defied all reason. People spoke of a new long night, remembering the old stories that claimed it lasted a generation. Fear settled like a cloak over the land. Up north at Castle Black, the Night's Watch was in dire straits. Reports of missing rangers grew daily, and patrols returning from beyond the wall carried with them tales of entire wildling camps decimated. Corpses animated by icy magic walked at night, eyes shining with a hateful cerulean glow. The White Walkers themselves were glimpsed only occasionally, but their presence was undeniable. A malignant frost would settle on everything around them, and a wind that howled like tortured spirits accompanied them. Samwell Tarly, not yet a brother of the Watch in this alternate timeline, might have read of such things in old volumes, but none were truly prepared to face them. Lord Commander Corgyle could only pray for a miracle from the south, for reinforcements, for a king or a rebel willing to heed their pleas. The Black Brothers' numbers were too thin, their resources too scant. They stood upon the precipice of annihilation. Eddard and Brandon Stark led the Northern Bannermen in frantic preparations. The forges of Winterfell and the smithies of White Harbor rang night and day, hammering steel swords and arrowheads. But it felt like forging iron for a battle that might require far stranger materials. They had found caches of dragoglass in the caverns below the Frostfangs, but it was not enough to arm all who might need it. Still, they tried. A small portion was being shaped into arrowheads, spear tips, and knives, each one precious. Ravens were sent to Dragonstone, pleading for more obsidian. Whether they would receive any was an open question. The realm was in chaos. When Robert's and Rhaegar's allied force began its march north, the men muttered their misgivings every step of the way. Rival banners fluttered side by side, the Baratheon stag and the Targaryen dragon, the Stark dire wolf and the Tyrell rose, the Lannister lion, those few who had joined out of a sense of caution rather than conviction, and the Arryn falcon. The roads were muddy from the unseasonal cold rains, and morale was tenuous at best. Fights broke out in camp between those who still burned with vengeance for lost kin and those who defended the Targaryen prince's honor. But each dawn, the captains reminded them of the mission, whispering dark rumors of whites that never tired and White Walkers that carried death in their wake. Whatever hatred lingered between them, it paled in comparison to the terror of unholy foes who knew no mercy. In a private moment, Ned Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen spoke for the first time without the looming presence of Robert or their respective armies. They met on a quiet stretch of road near a leafless grove of weirwoods. It was a cautious meeting, each had only a few loyal men standing guard at a polite distance. Ned regarded the prince with a somber gaze, remembering all the heartbreak that had befallen the realm, but also recalling what Rhaegar had once been reputed to be, a noble soul, a man of music and prophecy. Rhaegar, for his part, saw the earnestness and sorrow in Ned's eyes, a reflection of the losses House Stark had suffered. They exchanged words about the war, about the future, and about the rumors of the White Walkers. Rieger explained that if the legends were true, a prophecy named a prince born amidst salt and smoke who would be the champion to stand against the darkness. He admitted he once believed it might be him, or perhaps his unborn child. Ned, raised on the practicalities of the North, did not put all his faith in such portents. Still, he recognized that times had grown desperate. If prophecy might aid them, who was he to scorn it? When at last the combined host reached Moat Cailin, the ancient fortress that guarded the entrance to the north, they found the region eerily quiet. The bogs were half frozen, something that seldom happened in summer. Corpses of drowned animals lay scattered, crows picking at them. The men shivered, their breath visible in the air. Even Robert, who normally bellowed his defiance at any obstacle, grew silent. The watchers at Moat Cailin reported that refugees were streaming south in droves, fleeing nameless horrors. Some claimed the dead themselves had attacked them. Many were too traumatized to speak. Others babbled about pale figures on skeletal horses made of ice. Each new rumor chipped away at the men's resolve. They pressed on, forging north on the King's Road toward Winterfell. Along the way, they came upon entire villages deserted or destroyed. The smell of death clung to the air. Men who had been hardened by the war of the usurper discovered that nothing could prepare them for the carnage they witnessed. Bodies lay torn asunder, frozen stiff, and sometimes they found footprints that looked unlike any man's. The uneasy alliance took on a new urgency. By the time they were halfway to Winterfell, even the naysayers among them realized that something monstrous was indeed afoot. Word reached them that Brandon Stark and his knights had gone ahead toward the wall, preparing the defense. The rest of the north was mobilizing under Eddard, who waited at Winterfell to confer with the arriving armies. And there, amidst the evergreens and the snow-streaked battlements of the ancient stronghold, something extraordinary happened. Robert Baratheon and Rhaegar Targaryen stood side by side, welcomed by Ned Stark and the assembled lords of the north. For all the old rivalries, for all the savage conflicts that had raged, a hush fell as they realized the significance of this gathering. House Stark, House Baratheon, House Targaryen, House Arryn, House Lannister, House Tully united. A once unthinkable coalition had formed, not for the sake of any king, but for the sake of the living. In the great hall of Winterfell, the fires roared in the hearth, but the warmth felt meager against the unnatural chill that pervaded the land. Lords and knights crowded around heavy tables, while stewards hurried about with ale and boiled stew. Whispers of dread filled the hall. In the flickering firelight, Ned Stark recounted what he had learned from the Night's Watch, from rangers who had barely escaped with their lives. He spoke of whites, rotting bodies possessed by an icy force, and the White Walkers who commanded them. His voice was grim, unadorned by any flourish, lending a stark credibility to every word. Robert listened with a scowl, occasionally draining his tankard in swift gulps. As the tales mounted, even his bluster failed him. Rhaegar's normally poised face tightened with controlled horror. Some knights pounded the tables in righteous anger, vowing to send every last creature back to whatever frozen hell they crawled from. Others sat in silent fear, unable to wrap their minds around an enemy that could not be easily killed. The question that loomed above all others was how to defeat them. Even if obsidian and Valyrian steel worked, they had only so much of each. Wildfire was proposed, but the memory of King Aerys' obsession with it made men uneasy. Besides, wildfire was unpredictable and might do as much harm to the living as to the dead. Then, in a corner of the hall, an older man, one of the maesters, spoke in a trembling voice about the legends of Azor Ahai, about a flaming sword named Lightbringer, and about the forging of alliances in the long night of old. Most present dismissed it as myth, but Rhaegar listened intently, recalling bits and pieces of prophecy that had driven him for years. He felt a strange stirring in his soul, as if destiny was close at hand. Or perhaps it was only fear. Regardless, they all agreed on one thing: they must ride to the wall, see for themselves the threat, and do whatever was necessary to hold back the others. If the realm had to be drained of every resource, if the forges had to burn day and night to craft arms of dragoglass, so be it. Survival took precedence over any crown. And so, the greatest host in living memory, a combined force of southern lords and northern houses, marched for Castle Black. The journey was arduous. The unseasonable cold had made roads treacherous and frozen streams impassable. Scouts reported glimpses of shapes skulking in the forests, and men who strayed too far from the main column often vanished without a trace. At night, the men huddled around roaring bonfires, trying to stave off a cold that seemed to seep into their bones. Tensions flared. Alliances of necessity are fragile. But Ned and Robert kept the peace on the rebel side, while Rhaegar and his loyal knights held their men in check. Each day, the gravity of their situation became more apparent. Eventually, they arrived at the base of the colossal wall which loomed before them like the edge of the world. Thousands of soldiers lifted their eyes to its vast icy height, shimmering under the weak daylight. Atop the wall, black figures of the Night's Watch stood vigil. Some watchers had tears frozen on their cheeks. Never had they believed so many southern lords would heed their call. The gates of Castle Black were opened and the men poured in, setting up a sprawling encampment outside the fortress. The courtyard and the surrounding fields bristled with tents of every color and heraldry. A hush fell as the watchers greeted lords and kings in the making, gratitude etched on their weary faces. Still, an unspoken dread hung in the air, for every day the White Walkers were rumored to draw closer. Lord Commander Corgyle greeted them with somber courtesy, his black cloak frayed from sleepless nights of worry. He had them gather in a makeshift war room, the largest hall in Castle Black, normally used for training, now crammed with lords and their retinues. Maps of the lands beyond the wall were pinned to wooden boards, marked with black lines indicating known sightings. They have pushed the wildlings ever south, Corgyle explained, pointing to a cluster of markings near Harhome and the Frostfangs. Entire tribes have either fled across the sea or been slaughtered. We have never seen such an organized advance. It's as if some mind directs them, pushing them toward us. He paused, meeting Robert's and Rieger's eyes. We've held back what we can, but we are too few. Our rangers' losses grow each day. A hush settled among the assembled lords. Ned asked, how long do we have before they reach the wall in force? Corgyle's expression darkened. A week, perhaps 2, if we're fortunate. We've repelled small skirmishes, but a great horde gathers. We can't say how many. They don't march as living armies do. They just appear out of the snow and darkness. Robert pounded a fist on the table, frustration etched on his face. Then we make a stand here. We have men, we have steel, we have more soldiers coming up the King's Road behind us. And if any damned corpse shambles up, I'll smash its face in. He was met with murmurs of agreement, though the men's eyes betrayed their fear. Rieger turned to Ned. We will need to distribute whatever obsidian weaponry is available. We'll also need watchers posted day and night, spaced across the wall. If just one White Walker slips through, we risk losing the entire realm. Ned nodded gravely. My brother Brandon went to Eastwatch to coordinate with our fleets. He sent a raven saying the sea itself seems to be freezing in patches. We need to protect our flanks. In the days that followed, the combined armies worked feverishly. The forges of Castle Black spewed smoke into the gray sky as blacksmiths shaped dragonglass, arrowheads, and spear tips. Lords and knights accustomed to chivalry and tourneys now faced the stark reality of a war against death incarnate. Warriors from the Stormlands, the Reach, the Vale, Dorne. Some who had never seen snow before found themselves shivering atop the wall, scanning the far horizon with a dread that grew by the hour. The old divisions between the rebels and royalists still simmered, but the looming enemy cast all lesser quarrels into insignificance. Men who had once tried to kill each other on the Trident now shared flasks of mulled wine to keep out the bitter cold, bonding in the face of oblivion. At last, the watchmen spotted movement beyond the wall, great masses of dark shapes drifting between the skeletal trees, like an immense shadow creeping ever closer. The horns sounded across Castle Black. 1 long blast for rangers returning, 2 for wildlings, 3 for White Walkers. The chilling triple call echoed in every man's bones. Thousands scrambled to their positions along the battlements, hearts hammering. The wind shrieked, bringing with it flurries of snow that blurred their vision, but still they saw them. Whites, an unholy legion of corpses, trudging through the drifts, eyes aglow with eerie blue light. Behind them, here and there, taller figures in icy armor drifted silently, their blades catching what little light there was in an otherworldly gleam. A hush, thick as the snow, fell over the defenders. This was no ordinary army. As the watchers lit signal fires, the combined forces readied for the first blow. Archers drew back on their bows tipped with obsidian arrows. Catapults were loaded with pitch and oil. Atop the wall, Robert stood near Rieger, an odd sight indeed, the stag and the dragon side by side, peering into the endless white. Ned Stark was farther down the line, coordinating the northern archers, while Jon Arryn marshaled the Vale Knights. Tyrell men from Highgarden and several Lannister bannermen were arrayed below at the gates, along with men from the north. The tension was palpable, like the stillness before a thunderstorm. The first wave came without warning, as if the dead simply decided to move. A horde of whites staggered forward in an uneven run. The defenders unleashed a hail of arrows. Fire-laden missiles soared into the swirling sky, hissing as they found their marks. Many whites crumpled, limbs snapping under the impact, bodies igniting. Yet more kept coming. And then the White Walkers at the rear raised their arms, an unnatural chill rippling outward. A horrifying crack sounded as sections of the wall's lower defenses began to frost over, the cold creeping impossibly fast, turning stone brittle. Cries of alarm went up. Men poured flaming oil down the ramparts, while others fought to keep from slipping on ice that formed beneath their feet. Robert roared, "Fight, damn you. Don't let the bastards get a foothold." He directed archers to rain more fire upon the walking dead below. Rieger, face taut with concentration, directed the men to target the White Walkers with obsidian-tipped ballista bolts. One sword and struck a pale figure. With a screech like shattering ice, it crumbled to shards. That small victory sent a surge of hope through the defenders. But the White Walkers were cunning, keeping to the edges of the horde, letting the Whites take the brunt of the assault. The men in black, Night's Watch veterans, poured onto the battlements alongside the Southern Lords. They were tired, battered, but defiant. The horns kept sounding the triple call as more and more shapes emerged from the forest. It was as if the entire wilderness had risen up in a tide of death. Down below, cavalry formations found limited effect. Killing Whites was one thing, but they just kept coming unless struck with fire or obsidian. Shouts of dismay rose as men found their steel blades freezing to the hilt, or else they chopped a White only to see it stagger forward, still dangerous. Only Dragoglass or Valyrian steel ended them for good. The battle raged through the day, if one could call that dim gray light day. The sun was but a pale disk behind the clouds, casting feeble rays. The defenders managed to hold the line, barely. Each time a White Walker tried to breach the gate or scale the wall with its unearthly powers, archers and ballista teams drove it back. Piles of burning corpses littered the field, filling the air with an acrid stench. But the cost was high. Men lay dead by the hundreds along the ramparts, and many more were wounded. Some discovered to their horror that the wounded could rise again if a White Walker was near. Quickly, the maesters and healers resorted to burning the bodies of their own fallen, tears streaming down their cheeks, to prevent them from being turned against the living. Night fell, and with it came a frigid darkness. Torches and braziers lit the wall, but the howling wind threatened to snuff them out. The shriek of the others carried on that wind, a hateful, inhuman keening that stabbed at men's hearts. Time felt unreal, an endless cycle of thrust and counterthrust, of frantic shouts and desperate prayers. Some men prayed to the Seven, others to the old gods, some to the Lord of Light, any deity that might help them survive until dawn. Valyrian steel shone here and there, Ser Arthur Dayne's sword of the Morny. In cutting through Whites like a glowing brand, Ned Stark's ice-forged blade, though not Valyrian, it was mighty, defending the gate, though he needed obsidian to finish the kills. Everywhere, men fought side by side with once-sworn enemies, forging bonds of blood that no royal decree could ever match. Sometime past the midnight hour, the White Walkers withdrew. A hush fell over the battlefield, broken only by the moans of the dying and the crackle of flames. Exhausted, the defenders slumped against the parapets, scarcely able to believe they had held. But they knew the respite might be brief. Indeed, scouts reported movement in the far distance, larger concentrations of Whites, perhaps tens of thousands more, gathering under the starlight. The next attack would be worse. In the command tent, Robert, Rieger, Ned, and Jon Arryn converged to assess their situation, faces drawn with exhaustion. Corgyle was there as well, along with several other lords. They pored over reports from outriders who had ventured beyond the wall. "We cannot withstand another assault of that size," Corgyle admitted, voice heavy with regret. "Our lines will collapse, and once the others breach the wall, there's no stopping them from marching south." Robert, wiping blood from his brow, let out a bitter laugh. "You sound as if you've already given up, Crow. I didn't come all this way to hand the realm to a bunch of ice demons." Ned shook his head. "No one is giving up. But we need a miracle, or we need to strike at them in a way they cannot withstand." Rieger looked thoughtful, remembering an old prophecy. According to certain texts, the others were once driven back by the last hero who wielded a sword of dragon steel, or perhaps it was something else, Lightbringer, if the legends hold. A flaming sword. Fire and dragon glass are our best weapons. If we had dragons. Robert glowered. "There are no dragons left." "Perhaps not," Rieger conceded. "But we can harness flame, maybe wildfire, if used carefully. Or we can find a way to channel the heat of the earth itself. Dragonstone has some portion of that power, but we are far from the volcanic rock of the south." He paused. Another path might exist, forging a weapon in the manner of Azor Ahai, though the stories are contradictory. Jon Arryn frowned. If the stories are true, Azor Ahai tempered his sword in the heart of his beloved. "I pray we find another way." Silence reigned, broken only by the muffled cries of wounded men. The glimmer of dawn's approach shone faintly in the tent's entrance. Outside, a horn sounded again, 3 blasts. The next wave was upon them. Wearily, they stood, each lord buckling on his armor, each preparing to face the unimaginable once more. Thus, the second day of battle commenced in a fury of ice and flame. The White Walkers, cunning as they were merciless, probed the defenses for weaknesses. They conjured bitter winds that blew from every corner, chilling men's hands until they could barely grip their weapons. They unleashed monstrous beasts reanimated from the corpses of dire wolves and bears, each more terrifying than the last, bounding up the slopes to tear at the defenders. Obsidian-tipped arrows brought them down, but not before they sowed carnage among the lines. The living fought with desperation, spurred on by the knowledge that retreat meant the end of Westeros. Robert led a charge on the ground, brandishing a massive spiked hammer wrapped with cloth soaked in oil and set ablaze. He roared his fury at the Whites, smashing them to splinters, the fire dancing in the swirling snow. Rhaegar, high atop the wall, directed ballista crews, making sure every shot that sailed into the enemy ranks was tipped with dragonglass. Ned and a company of Northmen raced along the battlements, reinforcing breaches. Each corner of the battle was like a pocket war of its own, men locked in life-or-death struggles with the undead. Halfway through that second day, the White Walkers attempted a bold move. They concentrated their icy powers at a single point of the wall, hoping to bring it down. The area near the old breach known as the Scythe began to crack, the ice groaning under immense stress. If they succeeded, it would create a gap wide enough for the dead to flood through. Lord Commander Corgyle ordered every able body to that point. Torches, braziers, burning pitch, anything that produced heat was hurled at the wall from behind to counteract the freezing magic. Men hammered the walls from the inside to dislodge brittle sections and keep them from collapsing. It was a frantic race to maintain the ancient defense. The White Walkers' shrieks rose in a chilling crescendo, spurring Whites to batter at the ice from the outside. A stretch of the wall started to buckle, sending shards of ice the size of cart horses plummeting into the battlefield below. At that critical moment, Rhaegar seized a brazier filled with glowing coals and, with help from Ser Arthur Dayne, used a specialized pulley to lower the brazier outside the wall. The glowing coals, fed by bellows, radiated intense heat against the frost creeping up the massive structure. The gamble seemed to work, the crack slowed, then ceased. With a mighty boom, the partial breach collapsed outward, burying hundreds of Whites in an avalanche of ice. A ragged cheer echoed from the defenders. Yet the day was not one. More and more Whites poured from the distant forest, as if an endless supply of corpses lay in wait. The men of the Night's Watch recounted old stories that said the others commanded frost spiders the size of hounds, and sure enough, those monstrous arachnids skittered out of the tree-line, climbing the wall with frightening speed, clacking ice-encrusted mandibles. Archers panicked, unleashing volley after volley of flaming arrows. Some spiders screeched and fell, while others found crevices in the ice to keep climbing. One reached the top where Ned Stark stood, sinking frozen fangs into the neck of a hapless footman. Ned, with an obsidian dagger in his offhand, lunged and plunged the blade into the spider's glittering abdomen. The creature made a sound like shattering glass and fell to pieces. Others were climbing, though, and men raced to repel them before they established a foothold on the parapets. And so the days bled into nights, each cycle of the sun and moon bringing fresh horrors. Supplies ran low, especially the tar and pitch needed for flames. Archers began to ration obsidian arrows. Frostbite claimed many men, especially those from the warmer climes. Fever spread among the wounded. Yet, incredibly, the living endured. Something about their unity, their desperate determination held back the tide of death. Each house gave its all, forgetting old feuds. The bravery on display was legendary, Knights of the Reach fighting side by side with Northmen they once sought to conquer, Lannisters and Tullis locked arm in arm in the shield wall. Dornish spearmen braving the cold to thrust obsidian-tipped pikes into the faces of Whites. Finally, after nearly a full week of relentless assault, the White Walkers retreated, withdrawing into the frozen forests. A hush of disbelief settled across the battlefield. Scouts ventured out, but the others had melted away, leaving behind only countless corpses and a landscape ravaged by ice. The living had won, or at least survived. No one dared celebrate yet, for the White Walkers were nothing if not patient. But as the days passed and no renewed assault came, cautious hope began to grow. The nights remained cold, yes, but the once impending sense of doom lightened. In that calm, with the battered armies still gathered at the wall, a great war council was held in the courtyard of Castle Black. Rhaegar Targaryen stood opposite Robert Baratheon, Ned Stark, Jon Arryn, and all the other lords, the brand new scars of battle marking them all. Many had lost dear companions, many had faced nightmares they would never forget. But they had discovered a power in unity that none had dreamed possible. The fighting men hushed as Robert lifted his hammer high. "We beat them back," he roared. We gave those icy fiends a taste of fire. A cheer rose, though subdued by grief for the fallen. Rhaegar raised a hand. But let us not forget the threat is not vanquished. We only turned them away. We must guard against their return. Ned Stark spoke, voice as quiet as ever, but carrying authority. Aye, the wall must be manned in greater numbers. The Night's Watch cannot stand alone. We must all supply men, supplies, and arms to the watch permanently. For a moment, the lords looked at each other, hesitant. Then Robert nodded. Agreed. God save us, but the crows were right all along. This is our shield against the darkness. We can't abandon it. The talk turned to the matter of who would rule the realm now that the immediate crisis was averted. Robert still blamed the Mad King for countless atrocities, and so did many lords. Rhaegar himself did not defend his father. He proposed that Aerys be stripped of the throne for the good of the realm, which stunned the assembled lords. He has burned too many, spilled innocent blood. My father will not yield willingly, but I cannot stand aside and let him imperil us all. Rhaegar's voice carried deep sadness, but also resolve. If it comes to it, I will remove him myself. Robert studied Rhaegar through narrowed eyes. And then what? You take the throne, your father's madness replaced by your rule? The question hung in the air, pregnant with old hatreds. Rhaegar gazed at him evenly. That is for the realm to decide. My hope is that we can forge a new peace now that we understand there are far darker threats than our petty squabbles. But if you and the others deem a Targaryen unfit, I will abide by that decision. I ask only that we not shed more blood than necessary. Silence reigned. The men who had followed Robert as their would-be king exchanged uneasy looks. But it was Ned Stark who spoke up. We have all lost much. My father, my brother, your father, your friends. Perhaps we can build a new era that honors those losses. If we can stand united on the wall, perhaps we can do so in King's Landing. Robert let out a long breath, haunted by memories of Lyanna Stark. He looked at Rhaegar, noticing the bandage on the prince's arm, the tired slump of his shoulders, signs of a man who had fought alongside them against a greater evil. Something softened in Robert's eyes. Very well. We end the madness in King's Landing. Aerys must go. The war that had paused for the sake of humanity's survival was not so much reignited as reshaped. No longer was it a rebellion in the old sense, it became a movement to unseat a tyrant so that the realm could stand united against whatever darkness lurked beyond the wall. Many men, exhausted from the northern campaign, journeyed south. They marched under banners newly allied, forging an alliance of houses that had just faced the apocalypse together. Rhaegar led a portion of the Targaryen loyalists who believed in him, not his father, while Robert, Ned, Jon Arryn, and even certain Lannister forces prepared to storm King's Landing, but with far more caution for the innocents within the city. As the host neared the capital, ravens flew overhead, a harbinger of the storm to come. Within the Red Keep, King Aerys raged and fumed at the news. His once grand court had collapsed into a nest of sycophants and terrorized servants. Wildfire stockpiles lay hidden beneath the city, Aerys' final madness, a plan to immolate King's Landing rather than surrender it. But word had spread of Rhaegar's triumph at the wall, of his alliance with Robert Baratheon, of the existential threat they had faced. The small folk whispered that Rhaegar was the prince who saved the realm, while Aerys had cowered in the Red Keep. When the allied forces arrived at the city gates, they found them open, guards who once served the crown now quietly standing aside. They too had heard rumors of the White Walkers and realized a Mad King was the last thing the realm needed. Aerys retreated to the throne room, but even his king's guard, minus those who had left with Rhaegar, looked uncertain. The city braced for a bloodbath. Yet Rhaegar insisted on marching in peacefully with a contingent of lords that included Robert and Ned. Thousands of onlookers crowded the streets to see the impossible sight, the dragon and the stag entering King's Landing side by side. Shouts of confusion and excitement rippled through the throng. At the Red Keep, they found Aerys perched on the Iron Throne, wide-eyed, hands stained with soot from the torches he clutched. Servants trembled at the edges of the hall. The floor still bore dark splotches from previous burnings. Aerys howled as Rhaegar approached. "Traitor! You betray your own father. I should burn you all. Burn them, burn them, burn them." He gestured wildly, expecting pyromancers to appear. But Ser Barristan Selmy and other loyal knights had already seized the wildfire caches. The city would not burn this day. King Aerys, in his final moment of defiance, sprang from the throne, lunging at his son with a dagger. Rhaegar, tears in his eyes, disarmed him with a swift twist. The Mad King tumbled onto the steps of the throne, shrieking, "I am the dragon." "You cannot," but Robert stepped forward, looking down at Aerys with a mix of loathing and pity. He raised his warhammer, and for an instant, time froze. Then, with one decisive blow, he ended Aerys' reign of terror. The throne room fell silent. Flames flickered in the braziers, illuminating the stunned faces of the onlookers. Rhaegar sank to his knees, head bowed. Robert's chest heaved. He took a long moment, then turned to the assembled lords. "It's done," he said thickly. "No more madness." The days that followed were a swirl of negotiation and soul-searching. Rhaegar Targaryen, as heir, stood to claim the throne. Many who had bled for Robert demanded he take it. Yet Robert, still haunted by the unity they had forged, saw that Rhaegar had proven himself at the wall, risking his life for the realm. Ned Stark, too, gently reminded Robert that peace might require mercy. Even Tywin Lannister, always calculating, judged that a stable Targaryen monarchy under Rhaegar could serve his interests, given the display of loyalty from the common folk. In the end, Robert Baratheon approached Rhaegar in the Red Keep's courtyard, where the prince sat mourning for the father he had lost long before death took him. "You should be king," Robert said simply, voice gruff. "I'm a soldier, not a ruler. And the realm might accept you now after what we faced. But hear me. If you ever turn mad like him, I'll be the first to take your head." Rhaegar slowly rose. He looked at Robert with sorrow and gratitude. "I swear, I will spend my life ensuring no darkness, neither from the north nor from any seat of power, threatens our people again. We have lost too much already." So it was that Rhaegar Targaryen ascended to the Iron Throne, crowned as King Rhaegar I. He named Robert Baratheon his hand, an appointment that shocked many but signaled true reconciliation. Ned Stark was recognized as Warden of the North, reaffirming House Stark's ancient role. Jon Arryn remained an influential counselor, guiding the realm's transition to peace. The war was over. But the new king's first decree was not about festivals or spoils. It was an edict that every region of Westeros must support the Night's Watch with manpower, supplies, and resources. The battles on the Wall had proven that the White Walkers were real, and none doubted they might return. And so, a fragile peace settled over the land. A peace born of shared horror and forged by unprecedented unity. The lords and small folk alike understood that while King Rhaegar sat the throne, while Robert Baratheon swung his warhammer in defense of the realm, and while Ned Stark guarded the north, they might just stand a chance if the others rose again. Rumors persisted that pockets of the dead still lurked beyond the wall, gathering strength in the darkest nights, but as the seasons turned, a new warmth crept over the land. Crops began to revive, and the memory of the long night receded enough for hope to flourish. Yet none would ever again dismiss the old stories of the others as mere fables. The songs would recount how, in the time of Robert's rebellion, the dead walked beneath a sky of swirling snow, and how the living set aside their differences to hold them at bay. The realm remained watchful, the men in black standing vigilant atop the ice ramparts. Ever after, the kings and lords of Westeros remembered that there were terrors in the darkness far worse than political rivals. And in that knowledge, they found a unity that might just endure. In the days that followed Aerys' death, the royal banners in King's Landing hung limp in a windless sky. Smoke still rose here and there from the pyres where traitors and innocents alike had once been burned at the Mad King's whim. In the throne room, the jagged metal of the Iron Throne gleamed in the strange hush. King Rhaegar Targaryen, uncomfortable in his new title but grimly resolute, walked its halls alone at dawn. His boots echoed on the floor, scuffing remnants of soot where the pyromancer's fires had scorched the stones. Only days had passed since Robert's warhammer struck down Aerys II, ending his cruel reign, yet to Rhaegar it felt like an age had swept by. Elia Martell and their children, little Rhaenys and Prince Aegon, had been safe in the Red Keep, kept close by fearful servants while Aerys' madness deepened. Had Tywin Lannister sacked the city, as once threatened, Elia and her children might well have perished. But the timely accord forged between Rhaegar and Robert had spared them. When news of Aerys' death spread, Elia had not wept. She had merely closed her eyes and said, at last, the realm might know peace. Her face was drawn from weeks of hiding behind locked doors, never sure when a new purge might claim them. Now she roamed the keep with the quiet dignity she had always possessed, meeting with Dornish envoys who had arrived uncertain whether to avenge or to rejoice. Doran Martell, her elder brother, had sent them to learn the truth. Instead of discovering blood and ashes, they found a city haltingly adjusting to the notion of a different Targaryen on the throne. Beyond the city walls, the storm of war had ended, but the scars remained. Countless soldiers who had marched under Robert's banner against Targaryen loyalists now camped shoulder to shoulder with them under makeshift tents pitched around the Blackwater. After nearly a year of bloodshed, the notion of sharing bread with former foes was surreal, yet so many had seen the horrors at the Wall that they could no longer view each other as enemies in the same way. They had stood against the White Walkers and their legions of whites, enduring unimaginable terrors. Small folk whispered that only by divine intervention or the strength found in unity had Westeros avoided utter devastation. In crowded alehouses near the Mudgate, soldiers traded stories of frozen spiders on the wall, of wights whose icy hands clawed from under snowdrifts, and of the pale, silent commanders who could shatter a man's sword with a single, chilling parry. They spoke with awe of Robert's flaming warhammer-smashing rows of undead and of Rhaegar and Ser Arthur Dayne lowering burning braziers from the top of the wall to hold back creeping frost. These were legends come to life. No one doubted that had they remained divided, the White Walkers would have flooded south. Inside the Red Keep, the newly crowned King Rhaegar convened his first royal council. He sat not upon the throne but behind a plain wood end table in what had been the Hans Solar, with Robert Baratheon to his right, Ned Stark to his left, and Jon Arryn, Hoster Tully, and a handful of other lords arrayed around them. Tywin Lannister was present as well, silent and watchful. The Golden Lion of House Lannister had not shed its cunning. Though Tywin had sent only token forces to the wall, he claimed he had always supported Rhaegar over Aerys, making vague references to past slights from the Mad King. If anyone doubted Tywin's loyalty, they did not speak it aloud, for the man still commanded a formidable presence. A score of matters demanded the new king's attention. Some of the crown's gold reserves had been spent or stolen during Aerys' final days, and the realm's finances teetered on the brink of ruin. Crops in many regions had died under the unseasonable cold, creating the threat of famine. War-torn areas in the Stormlands, Reach, and Riverlands needed men and coin to rebuild. And overshadowing all was the knowledge that the others might return. None could say if the White Walkers had truly retreated for good or merely lingered in the far north, waiting for another chance to strike. The defense of the wall loomed as a permanent priority. Shifting alliances, hungry peasants, half-ruined roads, Rhaegar faced the burdens of governance that would have tested the steadiest of rulers. Yet for him, no challenge was greater than bridging the hatred left behind by Aerys' tyranny. Robert wasted no time in pressing for certain demands. He wanted those who had abetted Aerys' cruelties punished, especially the pyromancers who stashed wildfire beneath the city, intending to burn King's Landing if rebels broke the gates. Rhaegar agreed that such monstrous plans could not go unpunished. The surviving pyromancers were apprehended, some faced execution, some were exiled to the ruined Targaryen outpost of Summerhall, and a few were placed under watch, forced to use their knowledge only under close oversight by the crown. With that done, Robert turned his attention to giving out lands and titles to men who had been loyal to him in the rebellion. Rhaegar, wishing to show good faith, allowed many of these grants, mindful that he needed the trust of House Baratheon's allies. Meanwhile, Jon Arryn spoke calmly of forging a new tapestry in Westeros, weaving together houses that had fought on both sides. Ned Stark concurred. The threat from the north, they said, had proved that the realm must stand together or perish. It was Tywin Lannister who first raised the question that hovered over them all, and what of this talk of a betrothal? The Baratheons and the Targaryens were once the bitterest of foes. Might not a royal marriage bind these new alliances more firmly? His voice was smooth, but his green eyes flicked between Robert and Rhaegar with keen calculation. At that, Robert's heavy brow furrowed. Lyanna Stark's disappearance and presumed abduction had sparked his fury, leading him to wage war in the first place. As matters stood, no one had a clear answer about Lyanna's fate. Some whispered that Rhaegar had taken her to a secret location, but he was adamant that he had nothing to do with it. Others believed she had been captured or even killed on Aerys' orders to further provoke the North. The details were shrouded in confusion. Eddard Stark had scoured the war-torn countryside before riding to the wall, but no trace of Lyanna surfaced. Part of Robert still burned with anger, convinced that Targaryen wrongdoing had robbed him of his beloved. But to tie House Baratheon to House Targaryen now, whether through new matches or some other arrangement, might help soothe the deep wounds across Westeros. Rhaegar, however, had a wife, Elia Martell, and 2 children. He would not cast them aside to forge a new marriage. The notion of putting Elia aside, as Tywin had once rumored, stirred revulsion in Rhaegar. He had grown to cherish Elia, though their marriage had been arranged for political reasons. Her gentle strength had saved him from despair many times. Even so, Targaryen dynastic politics had rarely shied away from polygamous or unconventional arrangements in generations past. But Rhaegar had no desire to reignite the realm's old distrust of Targaryen excess. Nor did Elia's proud brother Doran or the Dornish lords have any intention of allowing a slight to their princess. After a long and weighty silence, Jon Arryn quietly changed the subject, suggesting that men be appointed to reorganize the royal mint and restore the roads. Tywin did not press the matter. For the moment, the question of uniting Targaryen and Baratheon by marriage remained unresolved. Instead, the council turned to more urgent tasks: feeding the hungry, finishing the harvest in the regions that were still salvageable, and ensuring stable leadership in the Crownlands. Ned Stark, though a Lord of the North, chose to remain in King's Landing longer than expected. He moved with a kind of quiet purpose, haunted by Lyanna's disappearance. She had always been the guiding star of his youth. Now the realm spoke of her as a catalyst for the rebellion, yet no one knew for certain if she was dead or alive. Ned had pored over ravens and rumors since returning from the Wall. One tavern wench in the Riverlands claimed to have seen a young noblewoman traveling with soldiers loyal to the crown. Yet the details were vague, and it might have been a half-dozen other missing highborn girls. Another whisper said she had been taken to Dragonstone, but searches turned up nothing. Seldom did Ned allow himself to voice these fears, yet Robert sensed how heavily it weighed on him. Late at night, over cups of watered wine, Robert would grumble that if it emerged the Targaryens had hidden Lyanna, he would shatter their alliance. White Walkers be damned. Ned would caution him. We have no proof. War has a way of scattering people far and wide. She might yet be out there waiting for us to find her. Neither man took any comfort in these words, for they had scoured half the realm already. In the great September of Baelor, the Faith of the Seven conducted a solemn ceremony to mark the formal coronation of Rhaegar Targaryen as Rhaegar of the House Targaryen, the first of his name. Cloaked in robes of black and red, he knelt upon the marble floor while the High Septon anointed his brow with consecrated oils. Elia stood by his side, wearing a golden mantle embroidered with suns and spears in homage to Dorne. The new king's children looked on with wide eyes, Rhaenys marveling at the crystal crowns and shimmering vestments, and little Aegon fidgeting, too young to grasp the magnitude of the occasion. Lords and ladies packed the sept, many for the first time seeing Rhaegar arrayed in regal solemnity rather than battered armor. Robert was present in a place of honor, as was Eddard Stark, though both men had a certain grimness about them. The small folk who gathered outside the sept, thousands upon thousands, cheered out of relief as much as loyalty. They had survived a brutal war, they had heard terrifying rumors of the dead rising in the north, and they had lived under a mad king's shadow for far too long. If Rhaegar offered them even a fraction of hope, they would cling to it. Bells tolled across King's Landing as the crown was set on Rhaegar's silver hair, echoing over the rooftops and out past the city walls. The throngs roared with a fervor that might have shaken the very stones. And yet, behind the spectacle, the new king wore a sober expression, as though the weight of the realm pressed upon him from the moment the last bell faded. The next morning, Rhaegar and his council announced sweeping reforms meant to stabilize the kingdom. Each major region would contribute a set number of men to permanently reinforce the Night's Watch. A special levy of grain and foodstuffs was ordered to be sent north, along with shipments of charcoal, wool, and other supplies for winter. Smiths who had learned to shape dragon glass were invited to set up workshops in the north so that a steady supply of obsidian weaponry would be on hand if the others returned. Reports from the Wall indicated that many whites had simply melted away beyond the Frostfangs. Some had likely been destroyed by the White Walkers themselves if they became too damaged. Yet the Night's Watch had to remain ever vigilant. To that end, lords who refused to contribute might face royal censure. A measure of friction came when Rhaegar decreed new taxes to fund these efforts. Men like Mace Tyrell grumbled at the prospect of shipping so much grain north, claiming their own small folk needed to recover from the war. But the Tyrells had largely sat out the final stages of the conflict, their banners only truly mobilizing at the last moment. When confronted with the sacrifices other regions had made in the battles at the Wall, House Tyrell relented. They did insist, however, that certain trade rights and privileges in the Crownlands be granted to Highgarden in return. Ever the diplomat, Jon Arryn helped forge a compromise. Meanwhile, in the Red Keep's lesser chambers, the cogs of justice began to turn. Men who had committed atrocities under Aerys, torturers, zealots, vile whisperers who had condemned countless innocents to burn, were rounded up and tried. Ser Island Payne, who had once boasted about cutting out tongues for the king, was found guilty of heinous acts, but Robert intervened on his behalf, remembering how the man had been forced into service under threat of losing his own life. Some watchers murmured that Robert's mercy was ironically greater than the new king's. Rhaegar, though kindly by nature, felt a responsibility to see that those who helped perpetuate Aerys' horrors answered for their roles. In the end, Ser Island's life was spared, but he would serve in the king's justice as a headsman under oath, never again to speak of what he had done. Others were less fortunate. Several turncloaks who had personally lit the fires that killed lords and ladies in Aerys' dungeons were sent to the wall in recognition that though they deserved death, the realm might find better use for them facing the cold in the far north. They joined men who had stolen or killed during the war out of desperation, an influx of convicts that the Night's Watch was ill-prepared to house. But in a realm newly mindful of the wall's importance, the Black Brothers welcomed all strong arms, no matter their crimes, provided they would serve faithfully. Outside the castle, the small folk carried on, sometimes uncertain whether they lived in a dream. Rebels and Targaryens had fought side by side at the wall. Now, outside the Dragonpit ruins, a mixture of golden lions, crowned stags, dire wolves, roses, and dragons soared on standards above milling crowds. Former enemies drank from the same flagons. Bards sang sorrowful ballads of the war's tragedies, especially of Brandon and Rickard Stark's murders, and heroic tunes of the stand against the White Walkers. In the Street of Flower, an entire row of bakers devised sweet pastries shaped like the sigils of the great houses, an entrepreneurial gambit for the uneasy new era. Slowly, King's Landing settled into a precarious calm. Yet the question on many lips, repeated in taverns and whispered in noble halls, was what had become of Lyanna Stark. Did her fate remain tied to the spark of conflict that once burned across Westeros? Some insisted she was long dead, others that she had taken vows in the Great September, or that she had been whisked across the narrow sea. Ned Stark doggedly pursued every rumor, occasionally with Robert at his side. They followed Haflize, an old fisherman's tale of a pale maiden seen on an isolated island, a merchant from Lys who claimed knowledge of a captive northern lady. Always, they reached dead ends. Each failure weighed on Ned, who had lost his father and brother, and each time Robert's grief turned to anger. One evening, while the sun slipped below King's Landing skyline, Ned Stark made a quiet decision. He would ride home. The North needed him, Winterfell needed him. Brandon Stark had done his duty at the Wall, forging alliances with the Umbers, Karstarks, and Glovers to shore up defenses. The heaviness in Ned's heart only grew the longer he stayed in the capital, and with winter looming, the Starks' presence was required in their ancient seat. Before departing, Ned visited the Royal Solar where Rhaegar worked late into the night, Elia often by his side. Ned kept his voice level, though he felt a storm of conflicting emotions beneath. "I have not forgotten my sister," he said, "but I can do nothing for her here. My place is in the north, ensuring the realm does not forget the threat we faced. If you hear aught of her, your grace, send word. Robert will remain his hand, so I doubt I'll be needed for matters of governance." Rhaegar stood and placed a hand over his heart, sincerity etched on his face. "If ever I find a clue to Lady Lyanna's fate, I shall dispatch a raven at once. The debt the crown owes your house cannot be repaid with empty words. Go with the blessings of the realm, Lord Stark." Ned dipped his head, thankful for the courtesy, if not fully trusting it. As he left, he spotted Elia Martell's quiet gaze following him. She offered a slight, sympathetic nod, as if to say she understood the pain of losing loved ones to cruelty. Ned bowed stiffly and withdrew. The next day, he led a modest party out of King's Landing, heading north along the King's Road. Passing through the gate, he saw small folk wave farewell with genuine respect. Despite all the war's savagery, the name Stark commanded more admiration than ever. Had it not been for Ned's letters and presence, the Southern Lords might never have believed the White Walkers were real. Some said he had saved half the realm by drawing Robert and Rhaegar to a truce in time. If only he could have saved Lyanna as well, Ned thought. A pang of guilt accompanied him all the way beyond the city walls, across rolling hills still bearing scars from rebel and royalist clashes. Within days, Ned's company joined the stream of travelers heading north, some refugees returning home, others newly conscripted to the Night's Watch. The devastation of war was evident: burned farms, rotting fields, plague-ravaged villages. Yet there were also hints of renewal: freshly raised barns, wagons of supplies from the crown, and the glimmer of hope on people's faces. A crowned stag sigil on one cart traveled beside a red three-headed dragon on another, carrying grain and cloth. It was a sight unimaginable a year before. News of the new king's generosity filtered through every roadside inn. Rhaegar had reduced the tax burden on war-torn areas, had freed certain crownlands' villages from punishing tithes, and had pardoned some rebellious nobles who bent the knee. A wave of relief washed over the realm, though pockets of resentment and skepticism remained. The Dothraki, the Summer Islanders, the free cities across the narrow sea, none likely understood the transformation unfolding in Westeros, but travelers returning from Braavos spoke of new respect for King Rhaegar, the man who stood against ice demons. At the same time, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Not every Targaryen loyalist embraced the new alliances. Some older knights still viewed Robert Baratheon as the usurper, a man who had slain their rightful king no matter how mad he was. Others in Robert's camp remembered friends burned alive by Targaryen decree. Over cups of ale, resentful mutterings surfaced, talk of finishing the job someday should Rhaegar falter. But the memory of the Wall, of the White Walkers, and of the fragile peace that staved off annihilation kept open revolt at bay. Back in King's Landing, life pressed on. Robert Baratheon served as hand of the king with the same robust energy he once poured into battle. For all his flaws, he tackled certain tasks with surprising diligence, rebuilding roads, reorganizing the city watch, ensuring rations for the poor. He even found time to sponsor a grand melee in celebration of the new era, awarding a hefty purse to the victor. Ser Barristan Selmy, ever gallant, took the field at the melee but yielded early to a younger knight, perhaps to let others shine. Ser Jaime Lannister, still a member of the King's Guard, the one who had served Aerys at his most monstrous, competed as well, determined to prove himself in the eyes of the new king. Even so, the final victory went to a broad-shouldered knight from Tarth, Ser Gon, who unhorsed Jaime with a blow that rang across the yard. Robert roared with laughter and personally placed the victor's laurel. Rhaegar observed from a dais with Elia and their children, applauding politely. The realm needed such displays of pageantry to remind them life could hold more than war. Yet the court was not all tourneys and revelry. Whispers of a second wave of cold stirring beyond the wall came from Black brothers arriving in the city for supplies. They spoke of renewed sightings of whites in the haunted forest and of cryptic shapes glimpsed through the gloom. Though no major assault had transpired since the Great Battle, the Night's Watch remained on edge. King Rhaegar responded by ordering additional shipments of dragoglass to Castle Black. The forges in Winterfell and White Harbor churned out arrowheads and spear tips. A new sense of preparation pervaded the land. They had won one battle, but the war against the dead might stretch years or even generations. As months passed, small but meaningful shifts occurred in the capital. The Red Keep's dungeons were restructured, the cells cleaned. The skeletons of old victims were given proper burials outside the city, a symbolic gesture meant to close the book on Aerys' atrocities. Rhaegar also invited maesters from the citadel to comb through the vaults of the keep for any hidden caches of wildfire, determined to ensure no threat lay dormant beneath the streets. Whenever a hidden store was found, it was carefully dismantled under the watchful eye of the Alchemists' Guild, now operating under strict orders with no license to hoard lethal chemicals. Sometimes at night, Rhaegar read ancient prophecies by candlelight in his private library. Elia would find him there, scanning the old Valyrian scrolls that once belonged to his ancestors. He still believed in the prince that was promised and the threat of the Long Night's return. He knew the realm had only glimpsed the White Walker's might. In these quiet hours, he wondered if the forging of unity between stags, wolves, and dragons was the first step in some grand design of fate. Or perhaps the gods had no plan and only men's choices would shape the years to come. Meanwhile, from Dorne to the Vale, from the Iron Islands to the Westerlands, emissaries traveled to and fro. The Greyjoys, known for their reaving ways, eyed the changed state of the realm warily. Balon Greyjoy had tested the waters of independence once before, but seeing the unified power of a realm that had fought off ice demons made him cautious. The Ironborn chafed under the memory that they had missed the battles at the Wall entirely. Some said that while men of the mainland fought the dead, the Iron Islands did nothing. Balon bristled at the insinuation that his domain contributed little. He began forging his own alliances in the hope of wresting privileges or, at least, respect from the crown. Rhaegar, for his part, had no desire to provoke a new rebellion in the Iron Islands. He sent conciliatory envoys to Pike, offering them a greater share in certain trade routes if they refrained from reaving Westeros's coasts. In the Reach, Mace Tyrell boasted that Highgarden's fertility would help feed the north if winter worsened. True to his word, wagon loads of grain and vegetables rolled north along the Rose Road, boosting the Tyrells' standing in King Rhaegar's court. Yet Mace also angled for advantageous marriages. He had a daughter, Marjorie, still a child, and 2 sons. Perhaps one of them could wed Princess Rhaenys or another Targaryen scion if the line continued. Rhaegar and Elia made no immediate arrangements, partly because their children were still so young. partly because they wished to hold to the new principle that house alliances should serve the realm's unity rather than replicate the old Targaryen practice of betrothing children without broader consensus. Nonetheless, the Tyrell ambitions hovered in the air, a gentle reminder that politics in Westeros never sleeps. As for Tywin Lannister, he observed everything with cool detachment, often returning to Casterly Rock to manage his own domains. He had not pressed the matter of a Targaryen-Lannister alliance by marriage. Perhaps the memory of being refused in the past still stung, or perhaps he saw no immediate advantage. Jaime continued as a Kingsguard knight, determined to redeem himself from the stain of Aerys's final months. Tyrion, still young, remained out of courtly sight, rumored to dwell in the Rock's libraries or wandering near Lannisport. Cersei and Tywin had once hoped she might wed Prince Rhaegar, but that dream died the moment Elia became queen. In this new era, the Lannisters kept their ambitions carefully sheathed, waiting for the right moment to act. The greatest question of all still lingered like a shadow: were the White Walkers truly gone, or would they return in force? Ravens from Castle Black came intermittently. One reported that the new convicts who had arrived to swell the Night's Watch did not fare well in the cold. Another described how the wildlings had splintered, some huddled near Harhome, others roving the mountains. Tormund Giantsbane was named as a wildling chieftain leading a band south of the Frost Fangs, but few knew what to make of him beyond that. The Lord Commander, Corgyle, wrote that the Watch had fortified every castle along the wall that still stood from Eastwatch by the Sea to the Shadow Tower. The North heeded these calls, sending men, arms, and supplies. Even the occasional Southern Knight, fired by stories of battling the undead, would head north to earn glory. Sometimes they returned with a haunted look, sometimes they never returned at all. Autumn melted into early winter, and the realm braced itself. The unseasonable cold that had descended months ago had lessened slightly, as though the White Walkers' defeat near the wall had broken the unnatural freeze. Still, the nights grew longer, the days shorter. Snow fell across the north in a steady blanket. The Wolf's Den at White Harbor turned half its warehouses into granaries to store the grain from the Reach. In the Riverlands, the peasants set about gathering firewood, mindful of the bitter memories of the last cold season. King Rhaegar declared that no man, woman, or child should starve while the crown had coin. He commissioned a winter relief program, requiring each great lord to keep a portion of his harvest in reserve for distribution if conditions grew dire. Not all welcomed such royal interference. Some lords, especially in the Westerlands, murmured that the crown was overreaching. Yet the White Walkers' invasion had proven the difference between a unified realm and a fractured one. So they grumbled in their cups but complied, at least for now. A new rumor then began to filter southward from the north, carried by merchants and black brothers on leave. Deep in the snows beyond the wall, a small wildling village was found intact, but all its inhabitants had vanished in a single night. No signs of whites or White Walkers, no tracks of monstrous spiders, only emptiness. The huts stood undamaged, food still on the tables. The watchers who discovered it said there was a chill in the air that went beyond mere weather. Some accounted it to a new tactic by the others, one meant to spread confusion. Others thought it the work of more mundane predators like wargs or cannibal tribes. The truth remained elusive, and all the more terrifying for it. When word of this reached King's Landing, Robert muttered that he'd like to see any dead man come for him. Rhaegar, more measured, ordered an investigative party be sent north with the next supply caravan, including experienced rangers from the Vale and a handful of maesters skilled in healing. If the others had changed their strategy, the realm had to know. And if it was some other evil lurking in the far north, they needed to stop it before it grew. In those days, Robert spent many hours wandering the keep's corridors in the hush before dawn, a time he used to drink less and think more. Sometimes he found himself standing near the Iron Throne, gazing at its swords hammered together, or looking out over the city from a high window. He had craved vengeance for Lyanna for so long, but now that vengeance was complicated by the realm's abrupt pivot toward peace. Aerys's death, the alliance with Rhaegar, it was not the triumphant conclusion he had pictured in the earliest days of the rebellion. And with Lyanna still lost, his anger had no clear target. One such morning, he encountered Rhaegar already in the throne room, alone in the near dark, holding a lute across his knees. The king's silver hair, grown a bit longer, fell around his shoulders in pale waves. He plucked at the strings, producing a soft, mournful melody that echoed amid the massive pillars. Robert paused in the shadows, surprised. The scene reminded him of old rumors that Rhaegar preferred music to warfare. He had once scoffed at that. Now he saw a man who carried regrets as heavy as any warhammer. "You're up early," Robert said at last, stepping into the faint glow of distant torches. His voice echoed on the polished floor. Rhaegar rested his hand on the lute strings, silencing them. "I seldom sleep more than a few hours now," he admitted. "My dreams are full of the past, and of what might still come." Robert grunted. I'm not much for dreams. The day's tasks are enough for me." He joined Rhaegar, resting a palm on the dais' edge. "Still, the realm's quieter now than in years. We've done something right, it seems." The king inclined his head. "We have, and we must keep doing it. The north is too quiet for my liking. This new talk of vanished villages." His brow furrowed. "It plagues me that we might face another onslaught." Robert let out a breath, half a laugh, half a sigh. "Hells, we'll smash them again if we must, but I'd rather we do it with fewer losses. You saw the price we paid the first time." A pause lengthened between them. In that hush, Rhaegar picked a few more notes on the lute, a gentle tune that sounded almost like a lullaby. Robert shifted his weight, as if uneasy in that reflective silence, then cleared his throat. "I've been meaning to ask you something. It's about Lyanna." Rhaegar's fingers froze on the strings. He looked up, face guarded. "I've already said I know nothing of what befell her. I left King's Landing soon after my father's monstrous acts." Robert's mouth twitched with old anger, but he reined it in. "I believe you," he said grudgingly. "If I'd found out you had a hand in taking her, I would have seen you dead, White Walkers be damned. But you never wavered in your denial. I only want to know if there's something you haven't told us. Some rumor your father whispered? Some mention of a black cell?" Ares was cunning in his madness, always scheming. Rhaegar's violet eyes flickered with sadness. "He never spoke to me of it, not even once. Our conversations were rarely coherent in his final days. He ranted about traitors in every corner, about letting the wildfire cleanse the city. If he had seized your betrothed, he did not share that secret with me." Robert studied the Targaryen's face, searching for deceit. But all he saw was weariness. With a frustrated sigh, he rubbed at the beard stubble on his jaw. "Then she's gone," he said, "and I've no one left to blame for it. If she was taken by your father or his men, they're dead or scattered. If she's alive, she'd have reached out to Ned or me by now, wouldn't she?" Rhaegar had no answer. The echoes of the city beyond the stained glass windows filled the silence. Slowly, Robert turned and began to walk away. At the threshold, he paused without looking back. "Thank you for not lying. That's something, at least." Then he was gone, leaving the hollow sound of his footsteps behind. Each passing week carried them deeper into winter. The nights grew longer, the wind cutting like knives. Even the southern regions felt the chill. In the north, White Harbor's harbor froze in places, forcing ships to break through slabs of ice. Moat Cailin was half buried under drifts, though the causeway remained open. Across the realm, small folk built up their stockpiles, uncertain whether this winter would be short or the dreaded long winter of old stories. Crops from the last harvest were hoarded. Pigs and cattle were slaughtered for salt pork. Childbirth soared as couples hurried to wed before traveling became impossible. The Citadel's maesters declared that while no man could predict the exact length of the season, the unnatural cold from the White Walkers' intrusion might have thrown the weather off balance for years. In Old Town, Archmaester Abrose, renowned for healing, wrote to King's Landing, "If the White Walkers do not return in force, we may see the climate slowly return to normal patterns. Should they come again, the cold might deepen." The realm interpreted that letter as a cautious warning. Even the Citadel did not know how quickly the land could recover from the touch of the others. At times, Rhaegar pondered sending an expedition of knights and maesters beyond the wall, deep into the lands of Always Winter, to learn more about their foes. Ser Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, volunteered to lead such a quest, believing that knowledge would be the realm's strongest shield. But the Night's Watch, battered by the last incursion, pleaded that such a journey might provoke the others anew. "We keep the watch," one ranger wrote. We do not goad the darkness into stirring. So the plan was shelved, at least for the moment. As winter's chill hardened, the realm's spirit of cooperation was tested. Hunger in some corners led to banditry. Grieving families who had lost everything in the war grew desperate. Robert's City Watch cracked down on smugglers in the Blackwater Bay. Lannister outriders patrolled the gold roads near Casterly Rock to prevent raids. In the north, the Starks dispensed justice with typical fairness, but the cold threatened many smaller holdfasts. Brandon Stark, who had proven himself formidable at the Wall, worked with Ned to open Winterfell's granaries. Ravens flew in from the other northern houses with pleas for assistance, some in coin, some in manpower, to repel rogue freefolk who had apparently slipped through the Wall in small numbers. The Watchers did what they could, but the north was vast. Meanwhile, in the south, the tension between Rhaegar's loyalists and the old Targaryen hardliners came to a head. A small faction calling themselves the True Dragons emerged, led by a minor cousin of the Targaryen line, one Ser Aerion Rivers, a legitimized bastard of House Targaryen from a distant branch. He claimed Rhaegar was a usurper of his father's rightful legacy, that King Aerys had never been mad, but was driven to extremes by dire necessity. This small cult stirred trouble in the streets of King's Landing, painting fiery draconic sigils on walls at night and proclaiming that Rhaegar had betrayed the true Targaryen birthright by allying with rebels. King Rhaegar, not wanting to sow more bloodshed, tried to quell them peaceably. But soon, a cache of wildfire was discovered beneath a shop where these malcontents met. That changed everything. Robert personally led a detachment of gold cloaks to arrest the conspirators. They found twisted scribblings about burning false dragons and a half-finished plan to detonate wildfire near the Red Keep's granaries. Outraged, Robert smashed in the door, hammered down any who resisted, and dragged Ser Aerion Rivers before the king's justice. The man spat in Robert's face and claimed he was the last champion of true Targaryen might. Even Rhaegar's patience had its limits. With great reluctance, the king allowed a trial. The evidence was damning: ledgers of wildfire purchases, confessions from accomplices. Ser Aerion Rivers was sentenced to death, and Robert oversaw the execution himself, ironically using the same headsman's sword Ser Island Payne had once wielded under Aerys. The city took that as a sign that no shadow of the Mad King's cruelty would be permitted to grow. In that same grim season, ravens arrived from the Wall bearing disturbing tidings. 2 scouting parties had gone missing beyond the Wall. A few survivors, half dead with frostbite, stumbled back to Eastwatch with confused reports of eerie lights flickering in the far distance at night, followed by a sudden onslaught of whites. No major force, but enough to kill nearly every man. One survivor insisted he saw a woman in flowing gray garb leading them, with eyes like black ice. Another claimed it was only the White Walkers, clad in their translucent armor. Whichever the truth, it was another reminder that victory at the Wall had been temporary. The dire news reached King's Landing during the Feast of the New Year, a celebration meant to usher in hopes for spring. The city had tried to put on a brave face, stringing colored banners in the streets. Minstrels sang in the great hall of the Red Keep, and cooks prepared hot spiced wines to warm the guests. But as soon as the Raven's message reached the castle, the mood darkened. Rhaegar excused himself from the festivities and convened Robert, Jon Arryn, and the rest of his council in a private chamber. The gist was simple. The others had not vanished. They were testing the realm's defenses, prowling for weakness. If winter lasted long enough, they might gather strength again. Robert slammed his fist on the map table, rattling wooden markers representing armies. We need to do more than wait in fear. Let us sally out and crush them beyond the Wall. Jon Arryn, calmer, replied, The terrain is perilous, the conditions dire. We could lose thousands of men to cold alone. And what if that's what the others wish, to lure us out? Rhaegar folded his hands, frowning at the lines on the map. We risk repeating the long night's catastrophes if we overreach. But if we do nothing, they may grow bolder in the darkest months. Ultimately, they decided on a compromise: send a stronger Night's Watch vanguard to monitor wildling movements and White Walker sightings beyond the Wall, backed by small contingents from several houses, volunteers, not entire armies. A grand offensive into the lands of Always Winter was ruled out for the moment. The realm could not afford the potential disaster if that expedition failed. Instead, they would keep the bulk of their forces south of the wall but well prepared to reinforce the watch at short notice. Ravens went forth to gather volunteers for a new order of rangers drawn from across the Seven Kingdoms, men who had proven themselves in winter combat. Over time, this new auxiliary force would rotate in and out of Castle Black, learning the ways of northern warfare from the Night's Watch veterans. So the realm balanced on the edge of vigilance and fatigue, uncertain how long they could maintain such readiness. Peace was never cheap, and few men historically had the patience to stand forever on guard. But the memory of Ice-Eyed horrors still lingered in many minds. Tales spread that King Rhaegar himself had nightmares of a monstrous, frozen dragon stirring beneath the wall, an omen that if the living faltered in their watch, doom would come roaring out of the north. In this climate of uneasy watchfulness, a small miracle came to pass. Queen Elia Martell was found to be with child once more. The news broke one frosty dawn as Pycelle, once again in favor at court, announced it after examining the queen. Rhaegar's face lit with a rare smile upon hearing it, and he pressed Elia's hands in his. For a woman who had struggled with difficult pregnancies, it was a surprise and, perhaps, a sign of hope for the Targaryen line. The queen's ladies fussed over her, ensuring she had only the warmest chambers, the finest foods. Messages went to Dorne, where Prince Dor and Martell expressed cautious joy. This was an opportunity to deepen Dornish influence at court and remind the realm that House Martell stood loyal. Yet even this joyous event could not entirely eclipse the fear that had seized Westeros. Many saw the pregnancy as a new chance to unify the realm. Some speculated that if Elia bore a daughter, she might one day wed a northern lord or even the future warden of the West, weaving the houses tighter still. Others simply saw it as further reason for Robert and Rhaegar to remain on good terms, for if the Targaryen line expanded peacefully, the impetus for renewed rebellion might fade. Robert himself had mixed feelings. He no longer openly clamored for Targaryen blood. Perhaps the horror of the White Walkers had shifted his perspective, or maybe he was simply too weary to hate. But hearing of Elia's pregnancy gave him a sense of a future he had once believed would belong to him and Lyanna. He raised a cup to the queen's health with a forced grin that turned into genuine warmth by the second sip. The realm's next great test came in the form of a monstrous snowstorm that slammed into the north in the late winter of that year. The wall bore the brunt, with blizzards howling for days on end, piling snow so high that entire watchtowers risked collapse. Castle Black itself was nearly buried along the east wall. Messages from the north arrived sporadically, describing how battered men strove to keep the tunnels clear. At the height of the storm, the watchers glimpsed silhouettes on the horizon, an army of wights, or so it seemed. But no attack came, and when the storm cleared, they were gone. Whether it was a trick of the swirling snow or the others testing the defenses again, none could say. When the snowstorm moved south, it turned into cold rains that drenched the riverlands and crownlands. Roads became slick with mud, hampering commerce. Sickness spread among the refugees still camped outside major towns. The New Year's hopes dimmed somewhat, overshadowed by unrelenting difficulties. And yet, slowly but steadily, a sense of survival took root in the hearts of the people. The war with Aerys was over. The monstrous foe from the far north had been driven back once. If there was more trouble to come, at least they had an alliance that spanned from Dorne to the Neck, from the Vale to the Westerlands. Even the Iron Islands kept to a sullen peace, wary of provoking the might of a united kingdom. In many a crofter's hut and a town merchant's shop, men and women told each other that, so long as the living stood shoulder to shoulder, the others could be thwarted again. King Rhaegar began sending envoys across the narrow sea, forging new trade treaties that would bring in fresh supplies of metals, timbers, and fabrics in exchange for Westerosi grain, iron, and even limited shipments of dragoglass. He also sought knowledge, hoping the ancient libraries of Essos might yield more clues about how to quell the White Walkers forever. In Braavos, the Sea Lord was receptive, eager to profit from stable trade lanes. In Pentos and Volantis, rumors abounded of red priests. Of R'hllor who preached about the coming darkness. Some said a priestess with deep red eyes had beheld a vision of a champion with a flaming sword. Rhaegar's envoys noted such claims but did not act on them. Yet those stories mirrored fragments of prophecy that Rhaegar had read in his youth. If the Lord of Light's followers believed the final battle was at hand, they might one day cross into Westeros, offering help or sowing chaos. No one could predict which. Meanwhile, the queen's belly grew, and with each passing moon, the tension in the Red Keep eased a fraction. A new child meant a new start, a fresh page in the kingdom's story. Rhaenys, bright-eyed and precocious, would read to her mother in the evenings, while little Aegon, brimming with energy, trained at swordplay with small wooden blades. Ser Barristan Selmy watched them fondly, remembering simpler days before Aerys' madness. King Rhaegar, too, often joined his children in the gardens, wearing a gentle smile. Those moments reminded everyone that this was not Aerys' court, soaked in fear and flames. Something kinder, if still wary, had taken its place. Not all felt so sanguine. Some men woke from nightmares, recalling the cold blue eyes of whites and white walkers. Lords from the Stormlands and the Vale urged Robert to press for a permanent southern force near the wall. Robert bellowed that he would not spend the rest of his life huddling in the north, waiting for corpses to dance. Jon Arryn, ever the peacemaker, reminded him that the volunteers' rotation plan was working well enough. But the question remained: if an army of tens of thousands of the dead arrived again, would the men of the Watch and their auxiliaries hold until southern reinforcements could march north? No easy answers existed. One crisp winter morning, a raven bearing the Stark sigil arrived at King's Landing. Robert and Rhaegar both hurried to the council chamber, only to find it was no dire warning. Merely a letter from Ned, bearing tidings from Winterfell. The message was a mix of personal and official news. Ned wrote that the winter in the north was harsh, but they were managing. Brandon Stark had returned from a journey to the new fortifications along the wall. The Umbers, Karstarks, and Mormonts were cooperating closely, strengthening their holds. No sightings of large White Walker forces had occurred since the last assault. Nevertheless, smaller groups of Whites were occasionally encountered, and the Rangers had destroyed them when possible using obsidian arrows. The personal note in Ned's letter spoke of no new leads on Lioness' fate, which Robert read with a clenched jaw. But Ned sent well wishes to the king and queen, expressing guarded optimism that the realm might endure the winter if they continued to stand united. At the bottom of the parchment, in a simpler scrawl, were the words, "We remember. The North remembers." Whether it was a reminder of the horrors Aerys inflicted or a pledge to keep watch against the new nightmares, no one could say. In the hush that followed, Rhaegar gently set aside the letter. His fingertips lingered on the Stark seal. He remembered the day Ned left King's Landing, his eyes filled with sorrow and quiet determination. Thinking of that gave Rhaegar a sudden insight into the kind of king he must be, one who earned loyalty by listening and acting justly, not by fear or spectacle. Aerys had sought absolute power through terror, and it ended in madness, nearly dooming the entire realm. Rhaegar intended a different legacy. Life in the capital stumbled onward. Craftsmen restored sections of the city walls damaged by stray rebel attacks and by Aerys' attempts to booby-trap the gates with wildfire. The Red Keep's towers were gradually scrubbed of soot and scorch marks. Many in the city grew used to seeing gold cloaks patrolling alongside soldiers bearing House Baratheon's sigil. The crown minted a new coin bearing Rhaegar's visage, though some older folk still kept King Aerys' coins out of habit or to melt down for other uses. Trade began to flow again, albeit slowly, as the chill of winter made shipping routes difficult. Braavosi galleys navigated the Blackwater, carrying foodstuffs and textiles. King's Landing's markets bustled whenever the weather allowed. When at last the Queen's time came, the city held its breath. The memory of Elaya's past difficulties weighed on every heart. A hush fell over the Red Keep's corridors, anxious servants pacing. Pycelle and 2 experienced midwives from Dorne attended to her. Rhaegar, who had once been dissuaded from entering the birthing chamber, insisted on remaining near, though tradition frowned upon it. All night the labor wore on, muffled screams slipping beneath the door, torches guttering in the windy halls. Robert sat with Rhaegar in a nearby solar, arms folded, doing his best to offer a presence of solidarity. Elaya's ladies prayed to the mother for mercy. Morning light spilled across the yard when a wail finally pierced the hush. Moments later, Pycelle emerged, shaky with relief. The queen lived and a baby girl had been born. Rhaegar rushed to Elaya's side, scarcely believing the good news. She was weak, pale with exhaustion, but managed a tired smile, pressing the swaddled infant into his arms. The child mewled, a tiny pink face framed by a scattering of dark hair. There in that moment, the entire realm's tensions seemed to recede, replaced by the fragile miracle of new life. The nursemaids whispered blessings. Princess Rhaenys peered in, eyes bright with curiosity, while Aegon hopped on his feet, squealing excitement. Pycelle proclaimed mother and babe healthy to the extent any birth in these cold months could be safe. By midday, word spread through the city. A new princess was born, named Daenerys. It was a name that carried echoes of Targaryen queens past, though more recent than some. The small folk took it as a sign that the Targaryen line was firmly continued, no longer overshadowed by Aerys' madness. Celebrations erupted in the streets, vendors gave out small honey cakes, children danced in half-frozen squares. Soldiers of all allegiances raised cups to toast the new princess. Even in Flea Bottom, that den of poverty and crime, men lifted their heads to watch fireworks sparkle across the sky that evening, courtesy of leftover alchemist powders used in a less destructive way. For Robert, standing on a balcony with a flagon of wine, the sight was surreal. Here was King's Landing, once the seat of a king he hated with every fiber of his being, now lit up with the joy of a Targaryen birth, one he had no quarrel with. He glanced back into the corridor, where Rhaegar was accepting the congratulations of lords and ladies. The king looked exhausted, eyes ringed with dark circles, but happier than Robert had ever seen him. Something in Robert's chest loosened. Maybe this was the best outcome for the realm. Maybe the years of hatred and war had led them here. He took a final swig of wine and decided, for that night at least, to let the ghosts of the past rest. Of course, not every man in Westeros raised a cup. Some muttered that the Targaryens were multiplying, that once the threat of the others was gone for good, Rhaegar might show a more dragon-like side. But such rumors, for the time being, were overshadowed by the realm's relief and the memory of the terror they had faced at the Wall. Perhaps the new princess's birth signaled a gentler age. As spring approached, or what passed for it in the uncertain climate, a fresh wave of ravens arrived from the north, carrying contradictory reports. One message claimed a White Walker had been killed near the Milkwater, its remains melted to icy shards by a company of brave rangers. Another insisted the White Walkers had grown stronger, that ghostly shapes haunted the foothills near Craster's Keep. The truth was muddled, each rumor colliding with another, painting a picture of relentless tension beyond the Wall. But still, no grand attack materialized. The living had time to breathe, if only for a while. During that interlude, King Rhaegar made a decision that would come to define his reign. He proclaimed a great council to be held at Harrenhal, where lords and ladies from every corner of the realm would gather to discuss a permanent solution for the threat in the north. Not merely reinforcing the Wall, but possibly extending new fortifications beyond it, or negotiating peace with wildling chieftains who might help keep watch. Some balked at the expense and risk. Others recalled that Harrenhal had hosted the infamous tourney that once heralded the doom of many. Yet Rhaegar chose it precisely because of its size and central location, and perhaps out of a desire to redeem that haunted fortress. When the ravens announcing the council arrived in every castle, the reactions were swift. Lords who had never left their domains prepared to make the journey, unsure what alliances might be forged or broken in those halls. The rumor that some wildling representatives might attend was shocking to many. But if the White Walkers threatened them as well, why shouldn't the free folk have a seat at the table? Under guard, of course. The entire realm buzzed with speculation. Would new laws be passed, or would the king attempt some sweeping decree about the north? Some cynics predicted it would fail. Others believed it might reshape Westeros forever. Amid all this, the new Princess Daenerys grew day by day, a small symbol of hope. Elia recovered her strength, though the maesters warned she should not bear more children for her own health's sake. Rhaegar, mindful of that danger, swore to protect both her and their growing family. If the Targaryens were to remain on the throne for generations, let it be a line untainted by the madness that ended his father. When word reached Ned Stark of the Harrenhal Council, he felt a mix of relief and caution. Travel to Harrenhal meant crossing half the realm in uncertain weather, leaving Winterfell for weeks, perhaps months. But the cause was too important to ignore. If the houses were to debate a permanent defense against the White Walkers, the Starks had to be present. The North, after all, bore the first and worst brunt of any invasion from beyond the Wall. Ned also had an inkling that Harrenhal might be a place of answers, It was near the Riverlands, where he and Robert had first begun their rebellion. Perhaps rumors of Lyanna might yet surface from that region, if she had once passed through. However slim the chance, he could not ignore it. Thus, the realm prepared for yet another grand gathering at the castle cursed by Harren the Black's folly. Lords from the Vale planned their processions. The Tyrells set about organizing an entourage that would display the wealth and power of Highgarden. The Martells, newly tied to the throne through Elia, readied themselves for the long journey with a retinue of spearmen. The Lannisters weighed how grand a showing they should make to maintain prestige without appearing to overshadow the king. House Baratheon, with Robert at its head, readied lines of sturdy Stormlanders to accompany him, though storms battered the King's Road that spring. And in King's Landing, King Rhaegar and Queen Elia, holding baby Daenerys, bid farewell to Princess Rhaenys and Prince Aegon, who would remain in the Red Keep under the watchful eyes of Ser Barristan Selmy and a strong retinue. The children were too young for such a journey. With that, the royal procession departed the capital, wind whipping the red dragon banners overhead. Crowds thronged the streets to see them off, though the mood was subdued by the knowledge that Harrenhal held grim portents. Still, as Rhaegar led the column flanked by knights in gleaming armor, he could not help but recall the last great gathering at Harrenhal, the tourney where the realm had glimpsed the first cracks in Aerys' reign. This time, the realm arrived not for jousting and feasting alone, but for sober talks about the fate of the living. Perhaps this time, he thought, we will choose a wiser course. All the while, far to the north, the wind keened beyond the wall, sweeping over endless snowdrifts and black forests. The White Walkers, whether scattered or biding their time, remained an unspoken presence in every plan the king and his council formed. And so, with the bitter chill at their backs and the uncertain promise of spring ahead, Westeros marched towards Harrenhal, uncertain whether the days to come would bring lasting unity or new discord. Yet beneath all the pomp and caution, a quiet understanding united them. The others were real, and if the living did not hang together, they would surely perish one by one. In that precarious balance of hope and fear, the wheels of fate turned anew, carrying them toward a future none could fully predict, a future where stags, wolves, and dragons stood aligned, if only for a time, against the long night that threatened to devour them all.